with the first speaker of the session on auditory environments, which I'm myself also. The first speaker is Vincenzo Santarcangelo.
Yes.
His name correctly.
Nice.
And his presentation of his talk is Auditory Objects, a new way to define all things.
Oh, thank you to Professor Garay and Dr. Dorazio for the invitation. The title is a rephrasing of the famous English drama by Philip Massinger, A New Way to Pay All Debts, and incidentally of a beautiful album by a guitarist named Bill Orcutt. So the question is, and this is the question I'm dealing with since I would say 2012, why do we need to talk about sounds in terms of objects? And more drastically, do we need to talk of sounds in terms of objects? The fact is, we read a lot of literature and specifically of neuroscientific literature speaking of auditory objects instead of sound, or instead of auditory stream, which was the term coined by the well-famous book by Albert Bregman, Auditory Scene Analysis. So the question is, what justifies talk of object perception in audition? Of course, in philosophy and in psychology, there is a tendency in conceiving sounds either as properties or events-like individuals. But, as I said, much recent discussion among psychologists and neuroscientists has concerned auditory objects. So the intended analogy, of course, is with visual objects. That is to say, with visual processes involved in perceptually discriminating or attentively tracking or recognizing and categorizing ordinary material objects, and this is because we can see striking and illuminating parallels at a lot of levels between audition and vision. So between the perceptual processes and experiences that take place in vision and audition. Such parallels may warrant talk of object perception in a more general sense, in a broader sense of object perception, that is common to both vision and audition, so that we can speak in terms of audiovisual objects, as often has been done. The reasons are the following. Both in vision and in audition, we need to parse a perceptual scene. We need to solve some problems about information coming from the environment. Perceiving objects requires parsing a perceptual scene, and often a very complicated perceptual scene, into distinct units that one can attend to and distinguish from each other and from a background. Of course, in vision, this is easy because we have bonded, cohesive collection of surfaces, as Gibson put it, that are extended in space and that persist through time. It's very different, of course, in audition, where multiple distinct perceptible individuals might exist simultaneously, of course, so the question of time is crucial here. And each one might persist and survive change. The second reason, because we could talk about sound in terms of objects, is that both in vision and in audition, individuals, entities, undergo that phenomenon that Gestalt psychologists called figure-ground segregation and completion effects. So auditory objects are susceptible to figure-ground effects over time. So we have boundaries that are time boundaries instead of spatial boundaries. And one can, for example, shift attention among continuous audible individuals that differ in pitch during time. Furthermore, they are susceptible to completion effects over time in much the same way that visible objects are perceptually completed in space. For example, seeing a single visible region to contain behind, for example, this laptop as a barrier is analogous to hearing a sound stream to contain true masking noise, for example, as has been excellently showed in auditory scene analysis again. The other function that can justify talk of objects in audition as well as in vision is the tracking function of perception. With perception, we track objects. We track their persistence over time and in space. So tracking auditory streams or objects is like tracking visible objects. Multiple distinct discrete audible individuals, for example, temporary bounded notes of a tune, can form audible streams that comprise a single perceptible unit. One of the first examples Gestalt psychologists made is well known is the melody. The melody as intended as a wall with respect to the single notes that constitute the melody. So such streams are subject to figure ground shifts, and like collection of surface in the visual sense, they can be tracked through changes to their features and to one in respect to one's perspective. Of course, an auditory object can be formed also of the silences that divided single individuals in a tracking auditory object. So auditory object, of course, is not the single sound, but it could be a unified collection of sounds and silence that are analogous to spatially complex visible objects such as moving objects, for example. So that being the case, the auditory process involved in the perception parallel that involved in the visual perception of ordinary three-dimensional object. These parallels suggest a shared sense in which vision and audition cooperate in a general way to form an object perception. The first psychologist to speak in terms of object, perceptual object, instead of visual object versus auditory object was Michael Kubovi in 1981 with his first paper on these arguments, and then again in 2001 and 2010. And the definition is very simple. Is minimal, is taken from the Gestalt principle. So a perceptual object is simply that which is susceptible to figure ground segregation. So the notion of object itself in auditory perception is plausible if and only if the auditory object is integrated in a multimodal. Multimodal in perception studies is the very last trend. So integrated in a multimodal object processed both by visual and auditory systems and subsystems. On the back of this hypothesis, there is the so-called hypothesis of the what and where pathways, which was firstly formulated in 1982 by Milner and Goodale about the visual perception. That is the hypothesis according to which there are two pathways. One is called dorsal, and the other one, the red one, is called ventral, for anatomical reason, of course. Whereas the dorsal or where stream is deputed to spatial processing of the visual scene. So, for example, location, movement, spatial transformation, spatial relations depends on on the dorsal or wear stream, whereas the object processing depends on the ventral or watt stream. So for example, the processing of color, texture, of the pictorial details, of the shape, of the size of the objects are always depending on the ventral or watt stream. Of course, this hypothesis is supported by anatomical, neurophysiological, electrophysiological, and behavioral evidence. Now, there are hypotheses that something very similar exists also in the auditory cortex. This is a very, at a gross level, representation of what happens when the watt pathway or the wear pathway is deactivated in cats. So Alain and colleagues demonstrated that when the watt pathway is deactivated, the cat is able to localize the sound. But when the wear pathway is deactivated, the cat is just able to hear the sound, but it can hear it without localizing it. I have just 5 minutes more, so this is the schema. This is the so-called conservative view of the formation of a perceptual object. You can see at your right, at the stage of the early perception, there is the production of elements that undergo grouping mechanisms that produce potential or proto-objects, as they have been called in the last years. A set of perceptual organizations that go, thanks to these grouping mechanisms, to the middle perception. At the stage of the middle perception, one putative of proto-object can arise to the attention. Attention is required to produce the figure-gram segregation we were talking about, which allocates processing capacity to the figure and leaves the ground relatively undifferentiated. So we have the figure, which is the sound we actually hear, and the ground, which is this undistincted ensemble of putative of proto-objects that have not arrived at the attention level. I will close with this very nice ontology of all the possible objects that we can hear, depending on the degrees of mind dependence of these objects. In philosophy, mind dependence is the relation that objects in the real world have with our mind and with our perception of them. So on the right side, of course, we have incorrect or inaccurate objects. On the more extreme left, right, we have hallucinatory objects. And in the square, we have illusory object, or at your right, correct or accurate object. Of course, they depend on mind-independent object, the last of the objects you can see, and they are auditory object, visual object, or, as we have seen, audiovisual objects. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Questions, comments?
Yeah. Yeah.
are not sound, like thinking sound, like this might be not sound, but it's more strict with the idea.
Yeah.
It's strict.
Yeah.
So the question is, what is strict? Like exact. I mean, I know that exact is you cannot say, but more it becomes more about what it might mean by string and how comparison with visual then works.
Well, the idea is that the object, the visual object, is not just the real material object you see in the external world. It's, as I said in one of the first slides, the surfaces of the object. So what do you see of the real object? So it's still mind dependent in a certain way. No? In this sense, the equivalent in the auditory domain is the stream, or if you prefer, the auditory object. Of course, you can use auditory object or auditory stream as synonymous. Stream. The stream is in Bregman terminology. The stream is a series of single, the melody. Say a melody is a typical example of a stream, because you perceive the melody as a stream, as a discrete unit, meaningful. Yeah. No, of course, an auditory object. So it's an object if it has some boundaries, and of course, boundaries are time related and non space related, like in visual objects. So that's the question. The question is the difference of boundaries, and so an object without limit, an auditory object without limit is not an object at all. Yeah, with meaningful, I was not talking about the meaning of the object per se. I was talking about an object with a beginning and an end, exactly like the laptop that I am seeing here, which is a precise boundary. For example, without boundaries. For example. Of course, I am at the scale of human perception here. So, of course, there are. Yeah. Okay.
Excellent topic for thank you again.
Thank you.
The second presentation is sessions by Boschi, Pazzeri, Boschi, sorry, Dutch, so Matteo de Caroux, Del Cor, Fitz, Holzman, and Dubois. I don't know who those will show up.
Thanks for having me here. It's a great pleasure to be here in Bologna, which is, incidentally, it's where I was born. I should probably specify that I come from an earth sciences, physics background, so I hope that what I say will not be too technical. I'm talking about essentially audification or sonification. The idea in general is that we take a seismogram, which is what you see here. A seismogram this is measurements of oscillations of the ground, displacement or velocity or acceleration of the ground. It's infrasound, okay? Earthquakes involve relatively low frequencies. You don't hear it. but we can speed them up and save the result as a WAV or MP3 or whatever file, and then listen to it, and that might be useful. That's what we are trying to find out. So if you Google I don't know, like earthquake sonification or something like that, chances are that you find something like this, right? So you see three things here. First, you see the raw data. Oops, then you don't see it anymore. Then you see a filter version, but don't worry too much about that. Then you see a spectrogram. One interesting thing, to me at least, is that in seismology, we are not really used in looking at spectrograms that much. We tend to look at the actual seismogram, at the actual weekly line. But, so you can see what you see here and what you hear also at that time. Those are aftershocks, okay? If here we are in Italy, I probably don't need to tell you much about it, but you don't really see them in the raw seismogram or even in the filter seismogram that much. But you can hear them very well, and then you can actually see them in the spectrogram also very well. So just as a general idea, there are things that are not so obvious if you just look at the data that become quite obvious if you listen to them. We are used to, as you know, we are used to look at data because someone invented a print in the 1500s, and then we've been used since then to exchange information by putting it on pieces of paper. We are used to look at things, but listening is also an efficient way of doing a lot of things. How do I never use Keynote. Maybe this is okay? No, view. Enter full screen.
Want to play the presentation?
Yeah.
Just play.
Oh, okay. Thank you. It's okay. Sorry. Maybe I'll be a bit late in the end. Okay, so seismologists started early on to listen to their data because they figured in the 50s, 60s, it would be a good way to tell an earthquake from a nuclear explosion. In fact, it was. But then again, this was the 50s, then people started to use computers a lot, and they also found out that a computer would be able to solve this simple pattern recognition problem very efficiently. So this approach was sort of forgotten. I'm obviously simplifying the history a little bit. Now, in recent times, it's not only my group, but a number of colleagues around the world, and particularly in the US, are beginning to think about things that we can do with sonification again. And so what I will present today are two experiments that I and my friends in France and in Columbia University, New York, conducted together, where we try to see if indeed people can interpret, can analyze seismic data in a fruitful way, whatever fruitful might mean, using sonification. I'm not, so if I gave this talk to a seismologist audience, I would have to insist, and I probably still need to insist on the fact that at this stage we are not trying to do something better than what seismologists are already able to do. We are just trying to figure out if we are at an early stage of this idea. So we're just trying to answer the general question, can, in general, we use sound to analyze a seismic observation? If the answer is yes, then maybe the next point would be to try to apply these techniques to problems that are more complicated than what you see now. The problems that I'm going to address today are actually fairly easy for seismologists these days. So in this first experiment, what you see here is what we call a beach ball of focal mechanisms. It's just a way to denote an earthquake. The way this pattern is oriented tells you things about the faults. If you're not a seismologist, you don't really have to worry about it right now. And then these instruments, these acronyms and triangles that you see around the map are stations, are instruments, seismometers that measure ground oscillations. This is a map of Oklahoma and surrounding states. There was a lot of fracking going on, I think, or similar experience. I don't know if fracking is the right word, but this is essentially an earthquake that was thought to be provoked by human activity, human geological activity in that region. So that's why it's been studied a lot, and we have a lot of data. We know very well everything about it. Okay, it's a magnitude 5. Okay, so it's not that big, but you would feel it. Okay, so what do we do? Well, I already told you how we turn it into sound, and then we have a bunch of volunteers, typically staff and students from our labs, that sit in front of a computer and listen to these sounds, and they have an interface that allows them to play with these sounds. So each of these icons represents one station, one sound, one recording from one of those stations from the same earthquake. You can click on it to hear the sound. You can move, and then I should say, the question that they are asked is very simple. Group together sounds that for you, for whatever reason, are similar. You don't need to be a seismologist to do it. In fact, most of the experimenters were musicians, acousticians, audio engineers, and so on. If you think it's similar, just group it together, and then we'll try to find out if what you do has some meaning also for us as seismologists. So I don't remember, because, yes. So here are some examples. What you've just hear on your left here, it's I might as well tell you, it's the sound recorded at a nearby source around here. And what you hear now, I don't know, and what you hear here is the sound from a relatively far away, I play it again, source, okay? I'm guessing that most of you would be able to tell that they are different in some ways. Or for you, they would be different, even if you're not a seismologist, even if you know nothing of the meaning that a seismologist would assign to all of this. Okay, so this is what happens after one subject took the experiment. And then, you know, the problem, and I've had to learn quite a bit of how perception studies are done, because that's obviously not my field, but that's the way that my colleagues in the Laboratoire d'Acoustique Musicale at my university taught me to organize the data. So we essentially, I'm going to explain it in a very simple way because it's very hard also for me. Essentially, you just take each of these results, okay? Each subject gives us a result like that. We take all of them and we average them together. And then, you know, each of these branches here in this tree corresponds to one stimulus, one station, one of these icons in the experiment. And if they're close, it means that people, on average, group them together. So these two stations, they're always or almost always grouped together. If they're far, like this guy again, and I don't know, this guy or this guy or this guy down here, it means that people almost always group them separately, okay? So they perceive them as different. And so then we form groups in a pretty arbitrary way. We say, okay, let's try to simplify this and just put together stimuli that people tend to group together. We form 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 groups. And then we map them on the geographical map that you've seen before. And you see that geographically what they're doing kind of makes sense. I'm going to move on then to the next experiment, and if you have questions, we'll discuss why it makes sense. But essentially, you see that there is the distribution is correlated with the geography, and as a result, with the geology of the terrain. So subjects, probably the main conclusion at this point is that subjects behave similarly, and some coherent categories emerge. And we think they make sense also to us as earth scientists. So then I have to be a bit quick on this second experiment, but in the first experiment, what we did was what is called a free categorization test. So people were very free to group things in whatever way they wanted to. In the second experiment, we actually construct two ad hoc data sets. Let's just focus on one data set because I don't have a lot of time. We have a bunch of quakes in Mexico, okay, or more or less with the same seismological properties, sort of the same source in different nearby area, the same rupture mechanism. And then we form two groups of data, recordings of these events made at stations essentially in oceanic islands. So the propagating wave just crosses oceanic terrain, oceanic crust, which we know very well that it's very thin. And then the other data recorded across North America. So the waves, the same signal now has traveled through continental terrain. Here are some examples. Okay. We did a similar experiment. Now the control variable, control parameter, was whether the fault was essentially was vertical or close to horizontal. So, sorry. What we do now, so again, it's very simple. Let's just focus on one of these experiments. We take this data set, okay? It's got each stimulus within this data set, it's either one or two, continental or oceanic. We just give them all to the listener, and we ask her or him to group the sounds, but, well, not to group the sounds, sorry, that's not the right word, to categorize them as belonging to either family A or B. We give them some example first, sort of like what you've just heard. Then we give them 20 unknown or a bit more, a bunch of unknown, or unknown in the sense that they hadn't heard them before, stimuli, and we ask them, do they belong to this family that you heard before, this one? Or are they more similar to this guy? Okay, and we do the same thing for thrust and strike slip. And the answers, and then, you know, we define as correct, so to say, whether the answer when indeed the sound belongs to the family that we had defined to be family. The choice of the listener corresponds to our definition of the two families. So yeah, it is a correct answer. And these histograms essentially shows the percent for each experimenter, the percent of correct answers on the horizontal axis, and on the vertical axis you have how many people scored that well. Okay, so here, for example, we have 6 subjects that scored around 75%. So that's pretty good. In the visual test, so we do exactly the same thing, what we do, show them examples and then we show them the seismogram, they do better. But then again, people weren't trained, and everybody is trained, even if they're not seismologists, we are all trained to look at data with our eyes. We're not really trained, you know, when you study physics, nobody is going to show you electromagnetic waves audified, and we just don't do that. So in this second test, where the auditory performance was really bad, well, yeah, I mean, it was so bad that basically almost everybody was below the 99% confidence level. We actually trained people. And that's what happens when you essentially ask people to come back and then do a test where at each time they give an answer, you tell them if it's right or wrong, right away. And they do that a few times, they repeat it until there is an improvement. And there's always an improvement, actually. And the fact that now we have 1/3 of the experimenters that is above the 99% confidence level, even if the number of experimenters, of course, is very small to make definitive conclusions, but you see that something seems to be happening. So I think I'm going to stop here. in the rest of our study, which is a bit more tricky to discuss, but we also asked people, why did you choose these two families the way you did? And we discovered that this actually, in many cases, correlates with quantitative features that we can go and mathematically measure from the data. So that's the fact that you have this clear distinction between this parameter as the signal-to-noise ratio in the two families as people group them. It means that indeed what they perceive as a signal-to-noise ratio is the signal-to-noise ratio that we can measure from the data. Sorry, I was going a bit fast on this last couple of slides, but basically, so the conclusions of the second experiment is that we think that on average, people can do it. That audition is enough to correctly classify seismograms, at least in this simple experiment. And maybe even more importantly, by training, training meaning like 20, 30 minutes of trying and getting feedback is enough to have a visible improvement. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much to show us this interesting case of basically kind of a personification of data. Yeah. Are there any questions or comments?
I have have you ever tried, or other producers you tried with the traditional approach? So not feeding this stuff to listeners, but to machine learning algorithms or...
Yeah, I mean, yes, I mean, but that's exactly the thing. That's what we do. That's what I grew up to learn to do. You know, the thing is that maybe that I should maybe insist on that point. What we do technically is not really called sonification, it's called audification, meaning that the waveform, the datum, it stays exactly the same. It's only the meaning of the horizontal axis that changes, meaning that in the real world, this is 4,000 seconds, so it's quite long, but it's infrasound, so to be able to hear it, you just have to speed it up. So this becomes about a minute, not even, I mean, a few seconds. Okay, so if we were to fit that to algorithms, then it doesn't matter if it's sound or...
Okay, so maybe I can create it. So is it a common practice for technological data to analyze it and extract features?
Yes, okay. That's what we do. We extract all sorts of things. Maybe the reason why I think what I do might be useful is that we are only able to extract an algorithm is only able to extract what we tell an algorithm to extract. A listener that doesn't know what it's looking for hears the whole thing and maybe can find a pattern, can find something that is not that we don't know about.
The speed up, so how much time do you have to get the track on average? What kind of accelerometer do you work with? Vertical acceleration or also like...
Yes, very, very good question. So,
and can I finish question? When you do the test, so depending on the speed at which you replicate sound, since our listening system is not linear, do you compensate to extend to... With our listening, so the behavior will not give us like just one thing because so do you compensate for that when you speed up the sound, the wave time that implies kind of result of the
so I answer to, okay, the first two questions are for me correctly easy. So we look at the vertical component because usually in seismology we know for a number of reasons it's one factor of noise rate. A seismological measurement of horizontal, you can see it now on your iPhone. So horizontal vertical. I mean, not south to west. But the vertical, for a number of reasons, is cleaner. But we could look at other components, which we didn't do it so far. Speed up, the way we do it, we look at the spectrum and basically try to make sure that all the spectrum of the original data is translated into the audible spectrum. So in the first experiment where we have very local data, so for a number of reasons that I'm not getting into, you have more high frequency sound, we use a smaller signal, about 10 to the 2. When you have lower frequency, you use a higher speed. Okay, so it's just a practical thing to make sure, but yes, it's something that you really have to see. And then the third question, this is a bit more difficult for me because I'm not sure that I see exactly what you're pointing at. I'll tell you what we do. It's very simple. All the listener can do is the volume. Everything else is there's a MATLAB routine that's called audified. That's what we do. So we change the meaning of the time axis. So we redefine exactly the way. Fit the result to audified. So maybe it's not the best thing to do, but
maybe some component might be not referred because you have a sense of frequency range. Another component might be
yes, I see what. Okay, now I see what you're saying. Yes. Yes, definitely. We did talk about that at some point.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Next speaker is, well, that's me. My presentation, however, is on the other laptop. Unfortunate. I suggest that I will just begin my presentation. In the meantime, let me change, and at a certain point, I will just start the presentation and see if I can find the correct slide with the points that I can write during my presentation. It will be an interesting experience. Okay. So, the title of my presentation is Sound to Support Medicine, Designing Hospital Environments. Narrative, it's perhaps maybe the oldest temporal design created by humans. And narrative is a means both to make the possible time more pleasurable and stories to desire. But narrative is also a means to structure time, to make sense of the things that are happening in the world around you, and turning them into a narrative is a way to try to give some kind of comprehension with regard to details that are happening in time. Now narrative, the way that I use it, I define it as a representation of a temporal development. In other words, the narrative is not a process per se, but rather a representation of a sequence of logically and chronologically related events. And the manner in which a narrative is represented, I would say that is the design part of the narrative. In other words, the way in which you intend to tell the story, the way in which you want to relate this logically and chronologically related events in your narrative is the temporal design. Now, the thesis that I would try to present during my presentation is that the narrative, as a temporal design strategy, may help in creating hospital auditory environments. There it is. Narrative. So narrative as a temporal design may help in creating positive hospital auditory environments. And for sound, it can have a profound impact on us. That's something that we all accept. Sound is something really profound, really potentially impactful. And especially in hospitals, a hospital environment is usually considered as a noisy place. And so the question is, how can we deviate or do away with this noise in order to make that environment more pleasurable for those who inhabit that environment, especially patients. Now, this presentation will discuss strategies for designing positive auditory environments using narrative strategies. And in this strategy, 4 concepts are relevant. First, auditory environment. I will explain that in a minute. Secondly, soundscape. Thirdly, the notion of ambience. And finally, of course, narrative. So these 4 concepts, according to me, are relevant when designing positive hospital environments. So I will start with auditory environments environment, like I said, is usually interpreted as noise. And noise, because we want to have we're talking about, noise I define following multichannel answer is defined as unwanted sounds given one's current needs, goals, and activities. In other words, noise is not something absolute, but something subjective. Some person's noise can be another one, other person's music, for instance. But one thing, if you interpret sound as a noise, this noise can be detrimental to the health of those exposed to it. And since a hospital is often interpreted as a noisy place, it means that in a hospital a lot of unwanted noises are present. So one way of doing away with noise, of course, by making it as silent as possible. And yet, the complete absence of sound may increase the patient's feeling of being isolated and lacking control. In other words, if you make sure that the patient cannot hear any noise at all, in other words, it's completely silent, that may increase the patient's feeling of being isolated in a hospital that's already a situation in which this feeling of isolation is pretty much present for us. As a patient, you're in control of other people and your own ability and to act proactively is really minimal. And so, trying to make the hospital as silent as possible is perhaps not the best answer to make the hospital or the environment as comfortable as possible. And so, the alternative may be to introduce wanted sounds, in other words, sounds that are pleasurable to listen to, that mask in some way or another those unwanted sounds, those voices we want to block. And so, we're looking for the creation of an auditory environment that is interpreted as positive soundscapes by patients. Now, as you may have noticed, we're making a distinction between auditory environment and soundscape. Auditory environments, and I follow Professor Salter here, may be defined as the totality of the actual sound that can be perceived in a space, as well as the manner in which this space transforms, blocks, or amplifies the sound. That is the auditory environment. The auditory environment, you could say, is the, as far as we can now look at it, auditory situation of a particular environment. Such as here now, hearing an orchestra playing in the background, very interesting, and those are all objective facts. The way in which we interpret this totality of sound can be called a soundscape. We're not always very sure. A soundscape is the relation between individuals, us here present in the group, and their auditory environment. In other words, the sound that we now can hear this moment in this room. As an environment of sound with emphasis on the way it's perceived and understood by individuals or by society. In other words, soundscape is listener-centered rather than trying to measure and identify all these individual sounds. And it acknowledges the subjective bond between the listener's sound and environment. Okay. The next concept that I said was relevant to creating one of the wonderful environments is ambiance. Now, an ambiance addresses the interrelatedness of environments and the subject that populate these environments. The ambiances, and I told you Hermes and Ginch, are ongoing and temporal negotiations between sensing body in relations to others and the environment. In other words, me standing here, giving my presentation, trying to do the best that I can in the meantime, taking care of other times, share the higher self. At the same time, trying to do all of you, seeing if some people perhaps doze off, doing other things, and trying to include them in our presentation as well. All those things can be called temporal negotiation of me trying to position myself here in this environment in what I think is a positive or productive way. That is my temporal negotiation. It's also attuning to an end. So this temporal negotiation, my trying to position myself in a positive manner here in this environment is a moment. It's called attuning to an end. Now, sound is a crucial aspect of an ambience. It puts inhabitants in the midst of the world, especially me here now talking to you, and my voice, of course, is a very important element to me trying to tune to the ambience that is the environment here, us together. And And sound has this interesting quality, if you will, that it can stimulate or frustrate proactive behavior. So positive sounds kind of stimulate the acting proactively, in other words, acting the way I want to, whereas unwanted sounds, thus noise, limits me or try to make the way that I want to act impossible. For instance, if you start playing really loud, that perhaps would be interpreted by me as noise, even though sounds are beautiful, but they hinder you in trying to do this presentation. And so sound can stimulate or frustrate proactive behavior that you want in particular areas in the time. And so what I'm looking for when I'm trying to design positive hospital auditory environments is an auditory environment that can stimulate this positive tuning to an academic hospital, stimulate proactive behavior with its inhabitants. Okay. Finally, narrative. Because my thesis is that narrative has to help us create such an environment in which this proactive behavior can be stimulated by all inhabitants. Tuning to an ambience is a matter of negotiation and can be stimulated by temporal design. Now, temporal design doesn't give a definition as well. It can be seen as the creation of alternative temporalities and more nuanced expressions of time. And for instance, through a temporal design called narrative. And through narrative, it can create an alternative reality. And we all know the experience of watching a movie for an hour has passed. For instance, we really more of it. And in other times, perhaps when listening to my presentation, you feel like that the minutes are slowly crawling forward and it may never end. Complicated case. And so, the sonic narrative may be considered as the creation of sequences of sounds that make sense to the people who listen to them and therefore enable a positive tuning to this environment. In other words, sonic narrative can be considered as positive consists of sound that are somehow pleasant to while we're listening to them because they make sense of them and they feel that they're in way in the sound. Now, my research didn't remain at a purely theoretical philosophical level. I also went in the field and asked people, nurses, hospital staff, visitors, also patients, what they felt an auditory environment should consist of, positive hospitals. And I came up with a couple of requirements. In the meantime, hopefully you'll work on it with auditory environment that is the background of the mountain. But never mind, we will just skip it. I guess that's because what the audio is how they do that. We'll just leave it be. What a nice combination of sounds of sea and crickets and everyone mixed in such a way that they sense a temporal development of the sense. Is a beautiful thing, or a temporal development. And so the notion of the passing of time was according to me also according to the test subject placed this sound state to really have this notion of this feeling of very way with the sound in the present time. But there are the requirements. First of all, it needs to mask unwanted sounds from the perspective of patients. Because, on the other hand, these sounds would be non-invasive from the perspective of staff members. Of course, you can reinvest in alarm sounds, but it would be resulting in a very dangerous situation. Hospital staff would be able to hear these alarm sounds either anyway. That's a beautiful purpose of alarm sounds. Alarm sounds would be audible to those people who didn't hear. That is no mere application. It needs to be pleasant. Pleasant, of course, is a very subjective term, but what prior research has shown is that nature sounds are usually regarded as pleasant. Other kinds of sounds were regarded as pleasant by my interviewees as well. For instance, the sounds from outside the hospital, which you can see if you're laying in bed and you look outside the window, you can see the outside world, but usually we have a big outside world, it also increases this feeling of being isolated. So what they requested was, people walking outside, the birds outside. So you can bring the sound from the outside inside the hospital through the creation of this auditory soundscape for the environment. Another requirement was to improve the privacy of patients. That was also a form of masking with it, to mask the sounds of the patient, to get crying, birds and dies. And finally, minimize repetition. In other words, don't get the same sound at the same moment during the day, and very tiresome and more eventually as well. And so I took these requirements into account while creating this auditory environment and this sonic narrative that consists of a sequence of sounds that represent a temporal reality. Fortunately, not here, but okay, let's quickly go to the conclusion. We have one of that. Now I tried to introduce to you what the idea that narrative strategies can use in order to design positive hospital environment. And so there are strategies to improve hospital environments by adding sounds rather than other ways to suppress unwanted sounds exclusively. That would really feel nicer on patients. And so I wanted to use sonic narrative as a means to help federal negotiations between the hospital ambience and its inhabitants. It's possible during the temporal negotiations that we need to proactive behavior law of its inhabitants. Now what was needed was a creative aspect that a sound designer, myself, can add to a hospital environment. In order to create sequences of sound that make sense in time and whose design for the environment that resonate in a positive manner and that makes the passing of time in a hospital environment. Thank you. Yes, yeah. Well, I tried to make these questions as little as leading as possible. In other words, I started by asking them how they perceive the environment without really referring to sound throughout the day. In other words, I asked them, okay, do you notice when you go into a hospital environment, operating or whatever, and what do you notice? And then I tried to slowly nudge the discussion towards sound. And for most of the time, the notion of sound, the issue of sound, you cannot spontaneously by the subject itself. They really said, well, when I walk into the hospital room, I know that it's not okay because there is a sound. I think that's the way we do the same step by step. I tried to turn the topic to sound. And later on, I also asked them, okay, how would your perfect hospital environment sound like in the hospital? So that's really what I heard. Yes.
Do you get different answers and requirements in state of the area of the patient?
Yes, especially, well, what's one thing, originally I thought, well, of course, I music. Music, everybody likes music, so music is something that we could use. But the opinions of patients, they differ massively when it came to music. So some people say, well, I like to listen to music when I'm lying here, and I think that's really an improvement for the environment. Whereas other patients, that's when I'm sick, I don't want to listen to music. It's far too tiresome to somehow listen to music, far too exhausting. So there were really different requirements, and the thing that I came up with, those, let's say, satisfy all the requirements, but I did feel that I tried to provide a certain middle ground that at least no one said, oh, part of sounding culture at all. And some people like it better than others. But yeah, so in short, yes, there were different software styles to incorporate them well.
We try to visit this.
Yeah, we have very little time, and I say your presentation will be so perhaps afterwards after all the presentations are done, I think then we can listen to
quite close to this kind of phenomenon, and it's made by one solution that we know all that phenomenon. Because the book now actually is last and that is exactly what we were thinking about.
Yeah.
So it is just that you find a lot of references.
Okay,
So because there is another definition of ambience, which is literally the atmosphere.
Yeah.
And also in this sense is a new book by Politecnico atmosferology. I don't know if it's a speech on atmosphere and published by Pierre. It's very
Grazie.
That will be a challenge then for you. Yeah, because I borrowed the notion of
Speriamo, vedi un po' l'audio sulla tengo.
Okay, without further ado, I'd like to introduce the final speaker of this session, because the original final speaker didn't show up, unfortunately. Gilles Barberis, if I pronounce your name correctly, yes?
That's right.
And his presentation will give a historical and technological journey through multi-channel sound.
Yeah, hi to everyone, and I want to thank Dario Dorazzo for the invitation to me for being here. I'm the Chief Sound Engineer of Nijmegen Ritrovata, a laboratory based in Bologna, and we deal with film restoration. So because of that, I've been doing quite some extensive research on history of technology for sound for film. In today's speech, I'd like to introduce you to a definitely not extensive journey from mono to multi-channel in technology for film. That will eventually lead to the way we perceive sound in theaters nowadays. So in an influential 1953 article, acoustic consultant William B. Snow provided an overview of stereophonic sound, and basically for the first time, and he emphasized the differences and similarities of various theoretical sound pickup and reproduction method, from mono-hour reproduction defined by Snow as a one-eared system, to a diotic system, which is a word seldom heard today, but basically meaning hearing a single channel of sound in 2 ears, to the binaural sound system. Well, beginning with the birth of talking pictures in the late 20s and continuing into the 50s, movie audiences, whether in theaters, assembly halls, and classroom, typically heard films by means of a loudspeaker reproducing single channel of monophonic sound. Incredibly, way before that, an early form of two-channel sound combining stereophonic and binaural techniques was demonstrated just 5 years after the advent of the telephone by French aviation pioneer Clément Ader. In the autumn of 1881, Ader transmitted musical performance from the Paris Opera House to listeners of the Paris Electrical Exposition located in the Palace of Industry 2 miles away. To accomplish this, he mounted 12 primitive music transmitters in the footlights. They picked up not only the voices of the opera singers and the sound of the orchestra, of course, but even the murmurs and the applause of the audience. 2 separate sets of wires were provided to send signal to the listening room. Each listener was provided with 2 separate receivers connected separately to the left and right groups of music transmitters. Ader's technique was later commercially promoted in Paris as the theatrophone, and theatrophones back there were installed in hotels and cafes using coin-operated telephone receivers, and even in people's homes. Similar versions of the technique remained popular in Europe from the late 1890s until the end of the 20s. However, even with subsequent improvements, the technology basically could only capture a limited range of frequency, and the weak signal had to be heard through telephone receivers. This, of course, precluded, until the end of the 20s, the possibility of reproducing sound for the enjoyment of a large group of people gathered together in an auditorium, basically watching a movie. And it wasn't until the post-World War years that improved electronic amplification allowed sound to be reproduced at realistic volume levels in sizable spaces. The ability to play back sound of reasonable quality for large public gatherings eventually led to the event of talking picture in the mid-20s. However, in the early days, recreating lifelike auditory perspective, multi-channel, was never under consideration because it was difficult enough to achieve satisfactory results with a monophonic soundtrack. So any thoughts of three-dimensional sound will have to wait for the future. However, things changed very quickly, and already in the 1930s, people attending to the premiere of a movie called Hell's Angels were listening to sound coming not only from behind the screen, but emanating from all around them during the film action sequences. Aviator and movie maker Howard Hughes wanted audience to feel caught in the middle of aerial fights, so he prepared two separate soundtracks for certain sequences. One for normal reproduction from the screen, dialogues, etc., and the other containing supplementary airplane noises, a gunfire, to be heard from the loudspeakers located around the auditorium. In the same period, we must mention the conductor, famous conductor Leopold Stokowski, who was a bold visionary who embraced modern technology basically as a key way to interest the public in good music. He was dissatisfied with the mediocrity of electrically and mechanically produced sounds currently being heard by the public. Stokowski worked closely with the Bell Laboratories and its director of research, Dr. Harvey Fletcher, to raise audio standards. On March 12, 1932, during a public concert by Stokowski and his orchestra, an historic event occurred, and Arthur Keller experimented with two-channel recording, finally, using two microphones, and a modified disc recorded with two cutting heads, producing two separate sets of grooves on the inner and outer halves of the wax disc. One of the pieces of music presented on this occasion was Poem of Fire by the Russian composer Alexander Scriabin, and this March 1932 performance is thought to be the earliest stereophonic recording of a major orchestra. So the word stereophonic wasn't coined yet. Now that a high-fidelity phonograph recording of two-channel sound have been achieved, Dr. Harvey Fletcher and Stokowski came up with an even more ambitious experiment, and they proposed to use multiple microphones to pick up the sound of a large symphonic orchestra performing live in one city and reproduce the sound through loudspeakers in another city many miles away. With such fidelity and convincing auditory perspective, the listener will feel they were hearing a real concert by actual live musicians. The first demonstration was carried out in the evening of April 27, 1933, and the sound of Philadelphia Orchestra performing live at the 3,000 seats Academy of Music was picked up by three microphones, one on the left, one on the center, one on the right, about 20 feet in front and 10 feet above the first row of instruments. The triple signal was from the microphone were amplified for transmission through three high-grade telephone lines to 4,000-seat Constitution Hall in Washington, D.C., 150 miles away. There, members of the National Academy of Sciences listened to a dynamic, full-frequency range reproduction of the music in true auditory perspective, coming from three loudspeakers behind a thin curtain, each connected to the equivalent microphone back in Philadelphia. There were two multicellular high-frequency horns placed in the left and the right side of the stage, with a frequency range from 300 to 13,000 cycles, and a single low frequency in the middle, a main speaker, covering lower bus from 40 cycles to 300 cycles. Pretty soon, in the search for new sonic improvements, Bell Laboratories had decided by 1939 to see if they could make 3-channel recordings on optical film that will equal or surpass the quality of the light transmission made between Philadelphia and Washington back in 1933. This turned out to be quite a challenge, first of all, because in order to replicate the sound of a 100-piece symphony orchestra, frequency from 40 up to 5,000 cycle will have to be covered, and the volume range needed to extend from about 30 decibel all the way up to 120 decibel, for a total range of 80 decibel. That meant almost doubling the frequency range and adding 30 decibel to the volume range of current optical soundtrack back then, while also keeping noise and distortion under control. In order to achieve this, microphone signals were fed through an audio compressor during recording and through an expander during playback. An extra pilot channel was also provided to make an accurate record of the actions of the compressor in the form of a control tone of varying level, which could later be used to control the expander. In the full 3-channel system, pilot frequencies of 1260, 3780, and 6300 cycles were generated and recorded together on one of the 4 optical tracks. When the film was played back, the combined 3 frequencies of the pilot track were separated by filters and used to operate the 3 expander units individually, expanding the sound of the 3 audio channels to recreate the original dynamic range. The rapid operation of the compressor and expanders might have resulted in something that is called hush-hush hissing noise. And the special steps were taken to avoid this. Basically, the frequencies, the low frequencies were recorded normally, but those above the 200 cycles were gradually increased up to 17 decibels. For playback, the complementary reduction in high frequencies was provided, so the sound was restored to its normal balance, while at the same time pulsating high frequency, the hush-hush hissing noise, was considerably reduced. At Stokowski's request, there was an eccentric addition to the system, an enhancement control, which looked a bit like a cash register. This enabled the conductor in real time to alter the loudness and frequency balance of reproduced music selection during the re-recording session, supposedly to make them sound even more impressive than in real life. So the 6 keys at the top adjusted the low and high frequency balance, and the 3 handles below could raise the sound volume of each channel by up to 10 decibel and lower them as much as 20 decibels. In terms of multi-channel recording, so not reproduction, but in terms of the recording before the recording, probably the first commercial outstanding experiment came up always with Stokowski, with the Universal movie 100 Men and a Girl, showcasing the singing talent Diana Durbin, and co-starring not other than Leopold Stokowski himself, playing his famous self. In one of the film key scenes, it was planned to have the camera, we will see them later, the camera zoom in on close-ups of different sections of an orchestra, playing specific musical instruments. It would have been important for the final soundtrack to match the picture by emphasizing one group at the time rather than merely being a recording of the entire orchestra. But there was a problem, of course. The music was set to be recorded by Stokowski and the Philadelphia Orchestra in April 1937, a month before the picture will even officially start production, and it would be impossible to anticipate the actual shooting and the final editing of the special sequence. So Stokowski himself came up with a solution suggesting the use of multiple channel recording, of individual section of the orchestra to provide ultimate flexibility for the eventual final sound mix. RCA engineers set up 8 separate recording channels, each consisting of a microphone, a preamplifier and a gain control, and variable area optical sound recorder. 6 of these channels will simultaneously record selected group of musicians, and the 7th will pick up the orchestra as a whole from a distance. The 8th channel was provided for recording a conventional soundtrack with a normal overall orchestra balance, and I'll show you now the sequence I was referring to. Let's see if the level is enough.
I'm sorry, but you must leave now.
Mr. Stokowski, it's about that newspaper story. I know who gave it to them.
You know?
Yes, I did.
You did. Do you realize how much trouble you've given me?
Oh, I didn't mean to, really. You see, what really happened...
Yes, but why did you do it? You must have had a reason.
Yes, I had a reason. I had 100 reasons. Would you like to hear them?
I certainly would.
Really?
Yes.
All right. One, two, three, four.
What's that?
Those are my reasons. You wanted to hear them, didn't you? Well, there they are.
So the sequence photographed now to represent the staircase of Stokowski's home was a true standout because of the multiple channel recording technique, and now you should listen a little bit, more or less, the different microphones.
But please, just a...
That's it.
Thank you so much. Questions, comments?
Yeah, they use telephone lines to stream in real time the different sound pickup from the music transmitters. Sorry? Telephone lines, yeah, high-grade telephone lines for reproduction and amplifiers, of course. Yeah.
When it comes to sound reproduction, when something new is introduced, it's always touted as this is indistinguishable from the original. So I guess that was a bit also like what the experiment with the orchestra playing on a distance kind of entailed. So you basically saw nothing on the stage, and you just heard the orchestra. If you kind of take that idea and you put it in the present with all the Dolby techniques and so forth and so on, do you feel that today's cinema, as far as audio is concerned, is also still trying to do the real thing, or is it doing something else?
Well, there's still a lot of possibility of improvements. In fact, probably the latest technology in sound reproduction in theater, the Dolby Atmos, has been trying to do something that was unable to do before. So doing something actually submersive sound or 3D sound, etc., by using phasing, delays, etc., which was inconceivable when the movie were like just 5.1 or stuff like that. So yeah, there is still a lot of range of improvement.
And do you feel that it is approaching the real thing, or is it perhaps literally larger than life and therefore again artificial in a sense? Or am I taking it too far?
Yeah, it's moving slowly, though it's moving slowly, so step by step also because every time that a new technology comes in, you need to renew every single theater, every single step of the workflow of production and post-production. So it's a lot of money involved. Thank you.
Okay, well, thank you again. Thank you all speakers. Refreshments will be served inside. You can take your drinks to the closing presentations and talk with students. So